Make it easy. And this is the hardest thing in pricing, right? So let's assume that you're entirely on board with value-based pricing and you're thinking about, getting the consistency and all that kind of stuff. The simpler you can make your pricing without losing big value pools, the better, right?
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
It's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the consistent relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Alon Ellis. Here are 3 things you want to know about Alon before we start. He is a partner at Monitor Deloitte. That's impressive. He went from industry to consulting to industry to consulting. That might be an interesting conversation. And he's training for a half Ironman. And you should see how buff he looks. Welcome, Alon.
I'm lost for words at the beginning of a podcast. This is going to be tough.
It's going to be really tough.
Should have been training up for this.
Yeah. How did you get into pricing?
I've always had a curiosity, like how do they decide what the price of anything is? I remember when I was a kid, you go on holiday and you go through like a market in some, faraway place and everyone's bargaining and there's always something to it, but it's an interesting problem. Like pricing meets everything, everything meets pricing. And that to me, I find interesting. I started off in a very weird little startup that did auto and home insurance price optimization, which is a bit of a mouthful and not that interesting, for like barbecue talk, but it's interesting because we basically had one way of doing things for a very niche, very complicated, high data volume kind of sector and an idea around how to price. And I basically got into that, found it fascinating, and we went through all these different auto and home insurers, mainly in the US and UK, doing price optimization and helping them, take into account lifetime value and price elasticity and make very, more sophisticated pricing decisions.
So would it be fair to say that you were helping insurance companies move away from a cost plus type pricing mechanism more to a value-based pricing?
Yeah, look, it'd be a combination of that and just getting more rigorous. So pricing and insurance is a funny thing, right? People think that they're doing cost plus. The actuarial background is really about loss reserving. I need to have enough money in case there's a catastrophe. And people thought, okay, well, that must be, cost, and then I'll just slap on, 20% or whatever the number is. And then, some product managers say, we need to be a bit more competitive in this area or that area, or, I was like, young men are a good example. They are particularly bad drivers, so we need to do something a little bit different, or we need to make it a little bit closer to the margin for, whatever arguable reason. And you'd always have this tension between the two. And the main thing that we did at that first company was to put a more rigorous framework around the whole thing, because none of it was value-based pricing. It was kind of a good intent on value, and then all the different parties within the organization would just kind of fight with each other to try to get their way, as happens in any big organization.
Right. That sounds like all companies. Yeah. So before we jump into the topic I really want to talk to you about today, can we talk about your career path for a second? How did you go from industry to consulting to industry to consulting? Or I guess a better question is, why did you do that?
I got 3 young kids now, and you always ask them like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they come up with all sorts of crazy answers. I couldn't come up with any useful answers when I left university. I just thought, oh, well, I'll have some fun. This will be interesting. The company that was interviewing me, they were really an interesting group of people. I interviewed in a house. The startup scene in Australia, it's still not enormous, but it was particularly small back then. And it just seemed cool and interesting. This would be fun. So to be honest, at the beginning, it was just to do something a little bit different. we went to the States, and that was great fun. And then one thing led to another, and I lived in the US for a while. I wanted to come home in order to have kids, and so that led me into Deloitte Consulting for about 5 years. That was great fun. You get to see different industries, get to apply that same conceptual framework, but into like power and utilities or transport and logistics or retail, and you see like the concepts bleeding across from one industry to another, which is always the fun part of consulting. I then had an opportunity to come up. I had a but between all this, by the way, the startup I was in got bought out as well. So then you got to see what being an American corporate is like, which is a unique experience as well. That was fascinating. We became part of LexisNexis. But then I went to Deloitte, and that was, you know, partly coming back to Australia, partly to see different things. And then I had a client who had some challenges, and they were going to basically restructure the entire business and kind of bring it up a level of sophistication. There'd been a whole lot of investment and a whole lot of things going on that were quite interesting in this transport business. And the new MD was a super interesting guy. He asked me to join, and so I, you know, couldn't refuse. Did that for a few years, and you get to be on the front line. I think that was one of the nice things that is difficult in consulting. Even when we do, you know, value share agreements and things like that, it's not the same as, you know, being at the negotiating table or, you know, being right on the front line of making the decisions. You're not advising, you're deciding. But then, like most consultants, I'm somewhat irrational, and I missed the chaos of consulting. And so after a few years, I went back in, and so now I head Deloitte Australia's pricing practice,
Nice.
amongst other things. There's always something interesting and random things you get to get involved in consulting. It's a fascinating industry to be in.
Yeah, the best thing about consulting, I think, is that you see so many different situations, opportunities. So you get a really broad perspective. And then when you go apply it in a specific company, now you get to go do the execution part. You get to see it work and go do something. And so both of them have their pluses. I could see why you'd go back and forth if you could. So nice. When I asked you what you were passionate about, you had said pricing consistency. Now, I might have guesses on what you mean by that, but tell me what you mean when you say pricing consistency.
When I started working, I thought, oh, you know, naively, this is the way it'll work. Someone's going to do the math and they'll figure out this is the way the price ought to be set. And these are the rules that you're going to go and negotiate it down. And it'll just be executed really well because, you know, everyone in the organization is going to be aligned and it's all going to work. And that's not realistic at all, right? I realized that was quite naive. So what I gained in appreciation for over time was, you know, you might have a good strategy, but if it's not kind of supported by an operating model, and then people have some kind of governance around it, and then you're monitoring the execution of that, and it results in a consistent and thoughtful conversation at the front line, doesn't mean anything, right? And so we're spending a lot more time these days making certain that we've got that end-to-end consistency and just getting the value out of all the thinking. And very often organizations know what they need to do. They might need a little bit of support getting through some of the decisions or putting some, you know, numeric accuracy onto some of the decisions. But that consistency is a really hard thing, and particularly where, you know, people have gotten so excited about analytics. That's been really good and that's been very helpful, but some of that's come at the cost of, you know, execution and thinking about how to make certain there's consistency in the kind of conversations people are having with customers. You know, you're not opening up all sorts of alternative routes for someone to get a different price and then essentially undo the good work that you thought you were doing.
Yeah, so I remember working in the semiconductor industry for a while, and one of the things that we would do stupidly is compete with ourselves, right? The customer would come negotiate with us over here, and then they go through a distributor and negotiate over there. And we're constantly trying to figure out, are we negotiating with ourselves or not? And so is that the type of thing you're looking at?
That was a big part of it. So, I mean, to give you a couple of examples, when I was out in industry, I was in a transport business, and the business had been part of a lot of different acquisitions as well. And some of the business was priced on a unit rate. So I'll come over to your business and I'll pick up 10 boxes, and there'll be $1 per box. And some of it was on a base plus kilo. So coming out to you will be $8, and then it'll be 20 cents per kilogram of product or whatever it might be, for argument's sake. If you're a customer, you have perfect information, right? So you can say, well, today I don't have many items, so I'll use the piece rate, and they'll come over and they'll pick up 2 items and it'll be $2. Tomorrow, I've got a ton of stuff that needs to be picked up, and I'll make the call out on the other rate. And because a lot of these organizations didn't have a good fact base, didn't have good systems in order to actually understand what was going on, the customer is able to triage these things. They're able to have perfect information about not only you, but the different versions of you, because salespeople have made all sorts of deals, and they had 20 account numbers and all that sort of thing. But they'd also have all the other competitors, and they'd be able to basically find the gaps in the way that you'd set up your pricing. And then on top of that, you'd have salespeople going rogue, and all the typical shenanigans you get with Salesforce effectiveness type problems. And so it's getting that right. We it's a tough thing when you put a salesperson into the role, and they've got to find that balance between I've got to create value for the customer, and sometimes they get to kind of almost an extreme customer advocacy. So everything is about us giving away stuff to the customer, or the other extreme, they're trying to screw over the customer, and that's never going to create a long-lasting relationship. You need them to be somewhere in the middle. The other big consistency problem we had was just making certain that we're not giving away the house. Everyone understands that we're in business to provide a service, but we have to be profitable in order to do that. That's actually a really important thing. You have to have that kind of economic nous in every pricing conversation that we're having.
So you brought up 2 interesting concepts that I often think of as being separate, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, or I should say being opposite. It feels to me like there are 2 types of pricing, people, techniques, etc. And one technique I'll call analytics, where I'm going to go through and I'm going to crunch the numbers, and I'm going to find the deals where we sold it below average price for the volume, and we want to move those deals up. And then the other side I'll call value. And that's where we teach the salespeople what value looks like to a customer. And we're having a conversation. We're actually selling value, and not just, hey, here's the price of the product and here's what delivery looks like, things like that. And I look at those as 2 very different things. Do you see them as opposites? Do you see them as simpatico, complementary?
This is the problem with pricing. There's lots of different ways to interpret anything. I'm always a big believer in you're selling value, but you may not understand what value is in the eyes of your customer. And this is probably the biggest problem that big organizations face, right? Once you're big enough, it's very hard to understand how a customer is interpreted, or what they use the service for, and what it means in terms of their economics. And so, my view is we always need to sell on value, but we need to make certain we understand what that actually means, not from our point of view, but from the customer's point of view. As a consultant, you often get called in because the client thinks that the price is being discounted too much, and we should be selling on value. But when you get people to describe value, they can't actually articulate it, or they'll come up with all sorts of things that are very hard to actually value and justify to a CFO. One of the exercises we often do at the beginning of one of these engagements is, you try to sell to me, explain to me why I should buy you versus a competitor. And they'll come up with things that might be nice, but are very hard to economically justify. It's manufactured here. It's all sorts of we've got this consistency in terms of some engineering thing that actually the customer doesn't understand, right?
Right.
Having those conversations in terms of the customer's economics, and then what's even harder, having the conversation in terms of knowing what the customer can do as an alternative, that's really hard. And I believe that it's always value-based pricing is the number one way, but with the big asterisk that you actually have to understand what value means from the customer's point of view, which is very, very difficult.
I could not agree with you any more than that. That's just incredible. I have conversations with people all the time where, it's like, what's the value of your product? And they have no clue, right? They give me some really cool thing they can do. And it's like, well, why do they care? Who cares? Right. And in the B2B space, I'm a really strong believer of the fact that anything that you want to claim as a feature or a benefit, you should be able to turn into a dollar value for your customer. And if you can't do that, you just don't understand the value of your product.
Yeah. I mean, for us, what we kind of frame it as is economic value estimation. So
yep.
One of the really nice things with Monitor, so it's the strategy arm of Deloitte, all the pricing people connect globally. And so, something comes up and we've got people who are trained consistently across the world, but there'll be some niche question about, pricing for, quarry services or cement or some, thing that you've not come across before, right? And so you reach out to the network and then you'll get someone within that pricing network who'll tell you about all these different features that are actually really, really important for pricing within some sector that you've never worked in before. And you finally, you understand, oh, hang on a second, that really, really matters. And as an outsider, I wouldn't have understood that. And I can explain now what the unit economic difference is for the customer. So I can justify that quite differently. Or the alternative, we've got a bunch of people who do a lot of procurement work. And so we'll talk with them and understand when they're doing the buying on behalf of clients, how do they evaluate the tenders and where do they stack all the different features and what does that practically mean for them? So you basically get a better meeting of the mind, because there's nothing worse than a client who's invested lots and lots of money into features that they think should have some value, but you've actually done this work and you figured out that no one really cares.
Right. Well, in the ideal sense, they hire you before they go build all those features to say, what's the value of the product?
Yeah, I mean, you would, that is the ideal, right? Australia is also an interesting economy to just view, in contrast to the US. I think it's been 29 or 30 years since we had a recession, and now we have the first one in that time period because of COVID. And so you think about it, if you're in management and you've never worked outside of Australia, we've had ups and downs within sectors, but we've basically at a macro level had unbroken economic growth for an incredibly long amount of time, right? Basically the time span of many people's careers. And so it's entirely possible for you to get to a point in your career where you've only operated in a growth market, you've always added features, added SKUs, added things in order to, demonstrate the growth of the business that you're operating. And now someone comes in and says, hang on a second, you built all this stuff and not sure the customers really care. It's very hard to justify, what are the, ways that you've understood, the alternatives the customers have and how hard they're pushing. They haven't necessarily had to face into that before. So it's a very, very significant shift in the market here.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because I would think that even if you're in a slow growth or a reasonable growth economy on a regular basis, you still want to win, which means you want to do better than your competition, which means you want to understand what's valuable to your customers.
You are right. And I think the answer differs in different sectors, right? The ones that are more easily kind of globally competitive, you'll see more of that, and some of them are a little bit more protected just because the barriers to entry are higher, and there's going to be all sorts of nuances across the market. So it's not a one size fits all, but I think it's also entirely possible to believe that everything you're doing a customer is going to love, because that's part of being in a business, right? Like people, you want people to have that belief. You want people to say, oh, we built this thing and it is the best thing since sliced bread, and look at all the great stuff it does. Surely everyone's going to love it, and they drink the Kool-Aid because that's part of having the passion for being in the company, right? So this is where the psychology in the real world comes in, and that's where I think you can't reduce this into a purely analytical process.
Yep. Well, it's kind of funny because you almost sound like Australians are different because we've been in this perpetual growth mode for such a long period of time. But I got to say, here in the States, you see so many companies who still don't understand the value of their product. They still, throw in features because they think it's cool, or they would like it, or the engineers liked it, or whatever it happens to be. And so it's the exact same problem. It isn't, I don't think it's unique to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has their own nuances. I mean, the thing with the US is the size is just incredible, right? And you can imagine how much easier it is to get into an organizational kind of construct where the business is so big that unless you have a guiding framework and someone has made the decision that we will price on value and everything will be done in the customer's economics, and this is what it practically means. So, there's no kind of room for misinterpretation. It's America, right? So a business can get absolutely enormous, and without that guiding set of principles, one part of the business gets really excited. The engineers say, oh, we need to have X, Y, and Z. And, suddenly that becomes disconnected from marketing, and, these things can happen, right? It's entirely possible just, without any deliberate effort to get into that mix.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice thought. I would bet you there's less than 24 companies that do that.
But that less than two dozen are very successful.
They're very successful. Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's just the nice thing is, and when I was in that industry role, so we were doing a turnaround, right? Things were not going well when we came in, and so we redid the entire go-to-market. And you had a sales team that had not had the confidence to push back on a discount request for a long time. They had this very complicated pricing structure. It was impossible to justify, and you kind of lost credibility. And the go-to-market wasn't clear. And when we redid it all, and we relaunched it in this kind of sales conference, and we basically indoctrinated everyone in, here's how to sell, and this is the process, and this is the way we're going to do it. It's going to be amazing, rah, rah, rah. They still didn't fully believe it until you then sat with them and you did a couple of negotiations, and they came out of it and they got a 10% increase on an account that they've never had an increase in. And then, they got a pushback from a customer, and they said, oh, hang on a second, this is why it's going to cost more, because this is the die font that we're going to deliver you, and that's worth far more than the cost of the service. If you want to do low value, maybe split your low value into, the post, and you can give us the stuff that's a bit more complicated. And all of a sudden, they feel good. They feel like they're not getting beaten up, and they can actually be proud of what they're doing, right? And so, as an experience to go through, it was quite empowering for the salespeople, because without that kind of guiding approach, you can imagine how tough it is, right? Like you're a sales guy and you've been told to do better. And when people are asking for discounts, just push back. And when that doesn't work, just find more business. Like, it's soul destroying. It's very hard, right? And so having that consistency in terms of, this is the way conversation has to be had. These are the numbers that will back it up. These are the materials that will support you in that, the case studies, et cetera, et cetera. Every now and then we'll have an escalation process where the mean guy, you have to get escalated to the mean guy, and that'd be me or something. And now I get to be the bad guy, so you get to save face and all that kind of stuff. And just from an employee NPS, or however you measure
Yep.
engagement, like it makes a difference, right? Because people are not being beaten up anymore on discounts.
Yeah. So the two things I'm going to pull out of that story, which I think are both hugely valuable. One is that salespeople need to know the value of the product from the perception or the perspective of the customer, of the market, right? So what is it that matters to them, and how are they thinking about it? And then the second one is they have to be confident that the pricing that we're using is reasonable and fair to the customer. And when they have those two things, boy, they could sell the heck out of our products.
Just to give you a silly part of the example, no one had reset the rate card, and there was a system problem that is not worth getting into, but basically it had meant that the system rate card had been cranking up at like 5% a year for about 15 years, and the market rate had stayed flat or maybe gone up 1.5%, 2%. And so the average discount that anyone was getting was 85% or some kind of ridiculous number, right? And you can imagine if you're the one in front of a customer that you haven't got a credible relationship with, and you say, oh no, I'm going to give you a good price. So what's the rack rate and how much am I getting off the rack rate? 80%, 90%. It's like, you lose credibility, and can you imagine how depressing that is? You say these numbers, and then the guy just, on the other side of the table starts laughing at you, and you're like, sorry, it doesn't make sense because of blah, blah, blah. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't instill confidence in the customer, and it's not a good way to be.
And the last behavior I want a salesperson to exhibit is to walk in the door, hand him a price list, and say, yes, but I'm going to give you a big discount. And those are the first words out of his mouth, right?
Yeah, what's that phrase? It's like hair. Once you lose it, it's very hard to get it back.
Yes.
You don't want to start a relationship off with, I'm going to give you something and nothing in return is going to be okay, right? Even if it was small, we would always want to coach the salespeople, okay, we're going to accept this discount. However, we're going to get them to lock into, this length of contract, or this different, pickup arrangement that helps our supply chain guys, smooth their processes, et cetera, et cetera. And, we do the same in other sectors as well, but you just want to have that back and forth. If you don't, why would the customer believe that you've actually given them a good price, right? They may actually think that you've got so much margin that you don't really care. You can just give away this money. It's fine.
Right. Alon, we are about out of time, but last question. What's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
Make it easy, right? And this is the hardest thing in pricing, right? So let's assume that you're entirely on board with value-based pricing, and you're thinking about getting the consistency and all that kind of stuff. The simpler you can make your pricing without losing big value pools, the better, right? Because that pricing will, that pricing structure, the incentive structure, all the alignment into the go-to-market, that'll persist in your business for, let's call it 3 years. And these really overcomplicated pricing structures make it so hard, right? It makes it very difficult for people to understand where they fit in, how they need to transition from one tier to another, and it needs a scientist to kind of map through it. It just makes it very hard. And it's not about the numerical complexity, but if you can't justify it to a 5-year-old, then you're probably making it too complicated. It needs to be simple and straightforward, and drive that alignment. This is the value we're creating, and this is the business model how we create it, and this is the pricing strategy that aligns to it, and then you're all good. No, no tricks, no black magic type stuff.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely brilliant. One of the things that I always teach is price segmentation. How do you segment your customers into chunks? And then I'm going to charge different customers different prices based on the segment. But in a way, that's the opposite of what you just said. And if we create too many segments, we create too much complexity. So that says we've got to be really careful as we segment our markets.
You never want to be in the position where two people are talking and they say, oh, hang on a second, you've been given a different price. I absolutely know that that can't be justified, which is a different statement in different sectors, right? Airlines, obviously, we're accepting that there are different prices, but in other cases, we're not. And then all of a sudden, someone's having to explain and justify the weird different pricing that you've given people, and that ends up consuming more time than anything, and the credibility of your whole pricing construct and the way you create value and bill it to a client is then put under question. You don't want to have that, right? Now, the difficulty in all of this is actually creating simplicity without losing lots of value. So I'm not an advocate of single number prices, but doing that really well is really hard, but quite important.
And that's the trade-off, right? That's the key trade-off. Alon, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn's probably the best. So just Alon Ellis on LinkedIn.
Yep. And your name will obviously be in the show notes, so people will be able to find that easily. Episode 110 is all done. Would you please take a moment to leave us a review on whatever platform you use? The vast majority of you are probably on Apple Podcasts, and Apple doesn't make it easy to find, let me assure you. However, if you get value out of the podcast, I'd be extremely grateful if you go through the effort to find it and leave us a review. And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or about pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.